Well, it does fit in with the pattern that we've seen of quite a blizzard of actions in the early stage of the Trump presidency, an idea that pretty much Donald Trump wants to put tariffs on everything. He's talking about reciprocal tariffs this week, blanket tariffs, and that this is the more targeted announcement, really, of any that we've seen so far. Mostly he's just announced that he's putting a flat tariff on imports from a particular country. But of course, we also can see from the market reaction, the dollar obviously has moved a bit on this, but stock markets don't seem to be crumbling on it. And the sense that maybe is this again an opening salvo of something that would become refined or even deferred as time goes on, because that's what we've seen so far from his announcements, be it about blanket tariffs on Canada and Mexico. I mean, obviously tariffs did come into force on China, and that's one particular exemption. But the interesting thing will be in this region to see whether the EU now feels it has to get into the fray. Europe's been watching all of this, no doubt, in quite a nervous fashion. And now do we see Europe say, well, we're going to have to preempt something here, so we are going to have to announce something ourselves against the US? Or do they wait to see when or how these tariffs might be enacted? Because that's also not clear at the moment. And then do you see some kind of European response come at that point? But certainly just another element in the complex soup, should we say, of tariff announcements so far.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, who does stand to actually be hurt most by these tariffs?
Well, the big one for both steel and aluminium is Canada, as well as Mexico. China for both, although China didn't export a ton of aluminium to the US last year. I mean, it really drops off after Canada as by far the biggest exporter for both. But you do see names on that list that are countries you would consider to be US allies. I mean, Germany, for one. You also see countries like Vietnam, Korea, Japan, the UAE, Bahrain. So it's a really broad church of countries that could be impacted by, but far and away the very biggest one of all of those is Canada.
Okay, so that's the key to watch in terms of response. This is all happening as China's retaliatory tariffs announced last week come into force today. Does this open the door potentially for further escalation on that front?
Well, it's a bit hard to know whether this 25% tariff would be on top of the blanket 10% tariff that Trump has announced on China or in lieu of, because, again, we don't know when some of these actions might be taking effect. So that's one aspect of it, because if it's then seen as an add-on already for China, then you will need to see some kind of response from China to it. What we have seen so far, though, is even though China has taken action against the US, they both seem to be looking for something that's quite calibrated, to not be seen as to be taking the next step of escalation. And certainly you can see a desire from the part of China at some point for Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, to talk to Donald Trump about this. And that call has not happened yet. Maybe it'll happen at some point this week, because when they get in a room together, they tend to be able to sort stuff out. We've seen that previously, and perhaps that's the next card that China's going to play.
And just a word too, Rosalind, another story that we heard from Donald Trump about Elon Musk finding irregularities, or rather his government efficiency team finding irregularities at the US Treasury. Not exactly clear what they were.
Well, that's right. It's unclear from Donald Trump's comments whether he was talking about treasuries per se, or whether he's talking about the payment system that operates through the US Treasury, because that's where Elon Musk and his Doge group had been focusing their attention really so far, is on payments to contractors and for grants. But Donald Trump referred specifically to treasuries, so it's a little bit unclear what he meant by that, and whether he was also referring to the payment system. And that's where we are potentially expecting announcements, a bit like the way that Elon Musk is looking at every government department and the payments that are occurring. But that certainly does raise a question about what did he mean by that, because no one's really talked about bonds so far. And that would be quite a big development if indeed that's what he meant. But it does again raise concerns about how much people are poking around in the cupboard Treasury, and what does this mean? You know, you can see that the incoming US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, says, don't worry, it's all encrypted, it's read-only, they're not able to see a lot or do a lot. But there are those elements of concern about if you start examining what's going on at US Treasury, where does that start and where does that finish?